Alright, thank you all for coming to my senior exhibition. I'd like to introduce my panel first. Mr. Brown, my academic coach and AP Government Politics teacher here at Staley. Coach Warner, head cross country and track coach here at Staley. Mrs. Daniels, central office representative for my panel and social studies coordinator for the district, and my freshman AP World History teacher, not AP, just World History. And Mr. Mundell, activities director here at Staley, and my Staley administration representative, and Mr. and Mrs. Scott and Maureen Lohr. They're longtime family friends, and Scott was my confirmation sponsor, so we go to the same church, and Maureen was my sister's confirmation sponsor, so we've known them forever. And my topic is lasting effects that Pope John Paul II had on the Catholic Church, researched by me, Asher Allman. My copyright disclaimer: all materials included in this presentation are included under the fair use exemption of U.S. copyright law, and they are prepared according to the Educational Multimedia Fair Use Guidelines and are restricted from further use. My essential question is, what lasting effects did Pope John Paul II have on the role of the Catholic Church on the world stage? And some reasons for choosing this: I am a practicing Roman Catholic, and I've always been inspired and interested in John Paul II and his papacy. The fall of communism is always a gratifying topic to talk about, being staunch anti-communist, and I really wanted to kind of delve deeper into the role of faith in the modern world, because a lot of people increasingly view faith as more and more irrelevant, but I view it as more and more relevant each day. Some words to know throughout the presentation: by world stage, I mean anywhere in international dealings between different nations. By fall of communism, I mean the late 80s and early 90s, when there was political unrest in Eastern Europe that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, that led to the fall of the Soviet Union, and ultimately communism as a whole on the world. Lay people and laity, I mean people that are not ordained members of the clergy in a church. By Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, is the era of kind of reform in the early 1960s in the Catholic Church, when they made a few change-ups in the Mass and other things. By ecumenical, I mean dealings between more than one faith and dialogue between them. And encyclical, I mean the letter/essay that the Pope writes periodically and sends out to the bishops. By communism, I really like this definition: a system of social organization in which all economic and social activity is controlled by a totalitarian state dominated by a single and self-perpetuating political party. And humanities, throughout my presentation, you'll be seeing humanities. They are things created by people, usually of an artistic nature. And the class definition we developed at the beginning of the school year was the means by which we, as a human race, archive a perspective of the world in which we live through all aspects of philosophy, language, religion, history, social and natural sciences, literature, culture, and the arts. When I went into this, some stuff I expected to find, I really wanted to find the impact of his actions as Pope, so how he was different to his predecessors and other popes before him, and the effect of his actions and how they're still felt today. This is my review of literature slide. There were a couple things that were particularly helpful, and these are significant because the top is a journal that I read before I really started researching. I kind of outlined several different things that I wanted to hit, and a lot of different things about John Paul II. My exhibition morphed a little bit since I read this first one to when I read this last one. This is an excerpt from a newspaper that I found. It was the last thing I read. It was also very helpful because I went down to an interview in Lexington, and I went to look around the church before I interviewed the priest, Father Hanson, down there. And this newspaper was like on the floor, back behind a little table there, and I looked down. On the front, there's Pope John Paul II 5 years later on it, so I picked it up, and that was a good score there. My interviews were also very helpful. First, I interviewed Dr. Tim Brennan. He's the Associate Director of the Bishop Helmsian Institute, which is a body that kind of helps lay people live out holier lives and discern their vocations. Father Stephen Hansen, pastor of Immaculate Conception Parish down in Lexington, Missouri. And then Bishop Emeritus Raymond Boland, former bishop of the Diocese of Kansas City, St. Joseph. My first subtopic is, what impact did he have on the fall of communism? Before I really delve into what he did, I felt it was kind of important to know who the man was. He was born in Poland in 1920. His name was Karol Wojtyła before he became Pope John Paul II. When he was a little older than me in 1939, when the Nazis invaded, he lived under the Nazi occupation. He was part of a theater group that was known for its moral opposition to the Nazis. They were underground. He was orphaned at age 20 when his father, the last member of his immediate family, died. And he saw the church persecuted firsthand under the Nazis and later under the communists. He was an underground actor and student. He wrote several different plays with political and moral themes, and as a seminarian he had to study secretively because actually some of his fellow seminarians were executed by the Nazis and they were found out to be studying to become priests. After he was ordained in 1946, after the conclusion of World War II, he traveled to Rome and studied there, and he was influenced by some of the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas and has actually later been compared to St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote about people being able to have freedom of conscience and come to their own conclusion about God, whether it be right or wrong. And you can see freedom of conscience was very important to him later as Pope in dealing with the communist regime, where they try to dismantle everything cultural about a people and build up their own new culture and control everything inside and outside of the person's mind. And he was compared to St. Thomas Aquinas because both of them took philosophy and incorporated it into Christianity and different relations between the two. After he came home from Rome to Poland, he returned to a new occupation under the communists because when the Allies defeated the Nazis in World War II, they pushed them out of Poland and let the communists in through the back door. He was a very well-known preacher and teacher. Under the communists, he actually had several youth that he would go on hikes and camping trips with, but he wouldn't dress like a priest because they wouldn't have liked him talking to youth and telling them actually about faith and God. And actually under the communists, they tried to tell the people to call priests Mr. rather than Father, but he wouldn't stand for that. This is actually a picture of him with his predecessor, Pope John Paul I. Something interesting I learned about Pope John Paul I was he took that name, Pope John Paul I, not just Pope John Paul. It was actually either a bishop or a cardinal that sent him a letter and said, your name as a historian I think is a little incorrect, it should be just Pope John Paul. The history will give you the first, to which Pope John Paul I said to his secretary, tell him thank you for the beautiful first paragraph of his letter, but I am Pope John Paul I, that is my name, the second is coming. Within the first week of his pontificate, he said that because he was only Pope for a little over a month. And Nowa Huta, back in Poland, was a very interesting thing to study about relations between the church and the communist regime. There was a town that was built by the regime that was meant to be a workers' paradise, but it would be a workers' paradise for ideal little communist workers who would be atheists. But the people of Poland in that town, they wanted a church, and they petitioned the government for a church, but they kept saying no. And multiple times, as a bishop, they would file building permits, and they would get denied. Then file building permits, and they would get denied. And eventually they got approved in, I think, the late 50s, only to be revoked 4 years later. And eventually, there was a church built at Nowa Huta, and it is still standing today. He was an uncompromising negotiator, and that sounds kind of contradictory, but in a sense it's not. Whenever he would talk to people, he'd be willing to negotiate and make deals, but when it came to principles of faith and the actual things that were important to the Catholic Church, he would not budge. He was a very vocal opponent of the regime, or as vocal as he could be. Something that actually illustrates his prominence before he became Pope is the communist regime in Poland would not let Pope Paul VI travel to Poland to say the Millennial Mass. So he, as I believe he was a bishop then, or maybe an archbishop, said it in place of the Pope. So if he's able to be a substitute for the Pope, you know he's going places. He was always a fighter for Polish culture. He was very proud of his homeland, even though he always learned about other people and other cultures. He was always a Pole. I really like this quote from him as a cardinal. It says that Polish culture is Christian from its roots. It cannot be torn away from Christianity without destroying it. And it's kind of interesting that he should say that because communism seeks to find cultures, erase their history, tear it down, remove God from the picture, and replace the state as the highest being in a person's life. And he would not stand for that. It was entirely wrong. Some more background and views. When the Second Vatican Council came around, he was for several of the changes that were made at that time, mainly the church being about lay people. He really wanted the laity to become active in their faith and take their principles into public life. He favored priests facing the congregation rather than having their backs turned during the Mass, and also favored Mass being said in a person's native tongue rather than Latin. Here you can see that his priesthood in Poland dealing with the communists is parallel and leads later to how he dealt with the larger communist threat as Pope. This is the emblem from the Polish Solidarity movement. They were an independent trade union that was led by Lech Wałęsa, who the Pope knew personally and came to know personally. And here's a little video starting to illustrate kind of what they were about early on.
In September of 1980, Solidarity, the first independent trade union in an Eastern Bloc Soviet country, was born here at the Lenin shipyards in Gdansk, Poland.
A year of strikes and protests followed as Solidarity sought democratic reforms. But in December 1981, the government struck back. It declared martial law and arrested thousands.
That was an excerpt from a documentary that's actually about Ronald Reagan, but the two of them actually worked together a lot during the Cold War, along with Prime Minister Thatcher of Great Britain, to bring down communism. There's some relevant information in that video. Something that was very integral in the fall of communism was the Pope's visit in 1979 to his home country of Poland. He was greeted by millions of people. The regime let him back into the country because he was from there, unlike Pope Paul VI, who was an Italian. So he came back, and the Russians kind of had a dilemma in administering their Eastern Bloc nations. They're like, do we let him back in and risk the effect that he'll have, or do we not let him back in and look like even more bad guys than we already are? I'm sure that wasn't their thoughts, but that was my thoughts. There's actually a documentary that just got released recently by the same entity that made the Ronald Reagan film, Citizens United, headed by former Speaker Newt Gingrich. And it's actually called 9 Days That Changed the World. I actually have this video, it's probably being mailed to me as we speak, but it chronicles his entire trip to Poland. Because while he was there traveling, giving speech after speech and mass after mass over these 9 days, he inspired the Poles. These are a lot more people than the few old ladies the regime expected to come and greet the Pope. They thought that not many people would come to see the Pope, but millions upon millions came, and even if they weren't Catholic or weren't necessarily that religious, they wanted to hear him talk about freedom, they wanted to hear him talk about faith. And a quote I ran across that I really liked was, "Fulcrum of revolution." And this really was the fulcrum of revolution, that everything turned on in Eastern Europe, and in turn went back to Mother Russia itself. He spoke of faith and history, because a lot of the history had been changed by the revisionist communists, or they omitted different parts, and he came and said, no, this is the way it was. We are Christian from our roots. God is real, God is present. Not the state, you have freedom. This is Lech Wałęsa. He was an electrician, later became president of Poland. He was the main figurehead of Solidarity. He was formed less than 16 months after the Pope's visit to Poland. Like I said, they were an independent trade union. They were a major movement. At one time, they had a third of the Polish population as members or involved in it in one way or another. There were widespread strikes, and eventually they forced the communist regime to negotiate with them, and they secured the right to strike and the right to protest. They were very aligned with Polish history, and almost all of its leaders were devout Catholics. This is a picture of the Pope and Lech Wałęsa together. He gave him support, he gave him advice, gave him frequent praise so that he was uplifted and he wouldn't get discouraged being actually on the ground in Poland versus in the Vatican in Rome. And Pope John Paul II gave Lech Wałęsa almost an untouchable status, because he was up here on level with the Pope, and if anything happened to Lech Wałęsa, the world would know who to blame. This wasn't some small-time seminarian who nobody really knew, but was important nonetheless. This was a big name and a big figure giving support to Lech Wałęsa, so communists really couldn't touch him. Here's another excerpt from that same documentary to tell a little more.
In June of 1982, President Reagan arrived in Rome to meet with Pope John Paul II.
Now, we don't know exactly what was said at that meeting, but when the Pope came out, he said Reagan is a man of peace. He genuinely wants disarmament. And that was very significant, because what it meant was the Catholic Church recognized that the President of the United States was inspired and motivated by fundamentally moral and decent sentiments.
What was different about this is that this was taking the anti-communist struggle right into Moscow's backyard. This was not Grenada or Nicaragua. This was Poland. And Poland was the pivot on which the whole game turned in the 1980s.
President Reagan, Prime Minister Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II believed Poland's anti-communist solidarity movement would be critical to bringing down the Soviet Empire. Separately, and often covertly, through their own governments and the Catholic Church, they provided financial aid and intelligence gathering to help keep solidarity alive.
These things enable solidarity to survive the martial law crackdown which the Soviets forced the Polish communists to impose. And that was the first time, really, that communist repression had failed. And that was so crucial to everybody. And here was the steamroller of history, the inevitable Marxist revolution, and all of a sudden it was stopped. It was stopped by the Poles, and the Poles were encouraged and assisted by Reagan, Thatcher, and John Paul II. And that is the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire.
I told the people who came to arrest me that I am the winner, that you will still come to me to ask policy. And right now, I said to them, you are putting the last nails into your own coffin. Don't confuse me for being a prophet or anything of that sort. I am a realist and I am a revolutionary. That's all.
At the very end there, that was like Valenza. I want to transition over to this map and timeline I have here. In 1979, the Pope came and visited Poland. In 1981, not too long after, Solidarity was formed. And at the same time, later, in 1985, over here in Russia, which is not that far away, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power. And he was a reformer, wasn't a hardline communist. And he abandons the Brezhnev Doctrine, which says that the Soviet Union will no longer militarily interfere in any of its satellite nations to suppress uprisings against communism. In 1986, the following year, he ends economic aid to the satellites. So, with Russian influence no longer coming in the vehicle of economic or military, this is opened up for regime changes. In 1989, in June, the Polish gained independence from communism and free elections. In September, Hungary gains independence. In November, the Berlin Wall falls, and later, Germany is reunited. In December, the Romanians get independence, and theirs is the only one where there was any degree of bloodshed. All the others were peaceful. Bulgaria, 1990, Czechoslovakia, 1990, Lithuania, Germany is reunited. 1991, there's a communist hardline coup against Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. And in the chaos, he cedes power, and another man, Boris Yeltsin, comes to power, disbands the USSR, and the Cold War is over. All stemming from 1979, when Pope John Paul II visited Poland. The Pope and President Reagan had a mutual respect for each other. They both advocated true freedom, which is not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to do what you ought to. Reagan admired Pope John Paul II's leadership, and actually one of my interviews I heard it said that Nancy Reagan declared that Pope John Paul II is the most manly man she ever met, which is saying a lot because she was married to Ronald Reagan. He gave credibility and good standing to the Catholic Church and in the struggle against communism. He was a very inspirational international leader. In the newspaper article, I actually read the term spiritual colossus, which I really wanted to include in here because it seems a very apt description of this Pope. He never backed down and was very firm in what he believed. Here's a quote from Lech Wałęsa. It's a bit wordier, but I really liked it and I couldn't crop it down. It said, the Pope started this chain of events that led to the end of communism. Before his pontificate, the world was divided into blocks. Nobody knew how to get rid of communism. He simply said, don't be afraid, change the image of this land. And the image of this land right here was changed a whole lot because of the Pope and Lech Wałęsa and everybody who played a role in solidarity in the fall of communism. At this point, I'll transition to my second subtopic, which is what changes did he make in the role of the Vatican in international affairs. Great communicator is typically a moniker given to President Reagan, but I think it can be very well fit to describe John Paul II as well. He was very cognizant of the wider world. He started to learn German at the age of 10, Latin at the age of 13, and Greek at the age of 14. So from a very early age, he was interested in other cultures and other people, and he wasn't just aware of himself, but people around him too, and he'd be able to communicate with them. I think before he was Pope, he actually spoke 8 languages, and he ended up being able to communicate effectively in over a dozen. He centralized the church, put more power kind of in the cardinals, the way I understand it from what I read. Rome assumed more direction in the governing of the church, and in his international trips, he wanted more loyalty to Rome rather than different priests and bodies doing kind of what they wanted. He wanted a unified church. He surrounded himself by a strong group of cardinals, and he internationalized church authority. It wasn't just a bunch of Italians administering the church through an Italian lens. It was now a wider group of people that was able to more effectively relate to the wider world, in my view at least. He increased the size of the diplomatic college. This is actually Vatican diplomats with Pope Benedict, but over 150 countries were represented to the Vatican during his pontificate, I think more than any previous. And it was during his time as Pope that the Vatican and the United States actually formalized relations. The church was a lot more active internationally under Pope John Paul II. When I conducted some of my interviews, they said that he didn't exactly change what the church was doing or its stances, he just changed how they went about doing it in relating to other countries. He broadened the diplomatic efforts, as, like I said, with increasing the size of the amount of diplomats. He enhanced the church influence, and when I interviewed Father Hansen, he kept using the word enhance over and over again. It wasn't necessarily a change, just made it better. And in a closer relationship with the UN to influence his policies, he actually spoke in front of the UN several times, I believe. Sent more ambassadors or nuncios to different nations around the world. Like before, the United States and the Vatican never had formalized relations before he was Pope. Here's a picture of him with President Bush Sr. He even sent delegations to non-Christian nations, such as those in the Middle East. And his relations with Israel were a lot better because he did something no Pope had ever done before. He visited a synagogue the first time ever. He changed some of the church's stances on condemnation of Jews. He really made the relationships between Catholics and Jews a lot better. He made a pilgrimage to the Wailing Wall, and in tradition with Jewish custom, he stuck his prayer in one of the cracks of the Wailing Wall. He had very open relationships with heads of state. Here's him with President George W. Bush. He was a very inspiring leader. In fact, right here in his audience with the Pope is when President Bush gave him, I believe it was the Medal of Freedom, or I don't remember the exact wordage, but that's the highest civilian honor that anybody can be given by the United States. He's a very peaceful man, and he liked to talk to people. This is a picture of him when he became Pope. That was the second time in less than a month that the cardinals had elected a new Pope, which was very significant. He met with Hindus and Muslims, met with people of all different religions. He discussed theology with them, and something very crucial was he went to Africa, which has large blocks of Christians and large blocks of Muslims, and sometimes it leads to conflict in Africa. But he wanted peace between the religions. He had peace days at the Vatican where he would invite different leaders from all sorts of different religions, and they would all get together and pray for world peace. And he respected everything that the different religions had. Rather than being divided by religion, he wanted people to be united. And even had people like the Dalai Lama, who typically would not visit the Vatican, come to the Vatican. The church was more reckoned with and visible on the world stage since he was the most traveled Pope ever. He was out and about with different people. People saw him. He was elected when he was 58 years old, so he was able to get out and do things more than other popes who were older and couldn't handle nearly as much. People may have disagreed with him violently, but they could not ignore him. This is a quote from Bishop Emeritus Raymond Boland, who actually met John Paul II. Like I said, he was more traveled than any previous pope, made over 120 international trips to over 100 different countries. Every time he went to a nation during like the 80s and 90s, the seminary enrollments would spike after his papal visits. More people, more men would want to go become priests. He communicated very effectively with different people. This is him with Mother Teresa. He was the first non-Italian pope in over 4 centuries, which is a pretty radical change. And significance of him with Mother Teresa is he knew her personally, and while he was Pope, he changed the guidelines a little bit of how you become a saint. Formerly, you needed 2 miracles to be beatified, and then 2 more miracles to be canonized as an actual saint. He made only 1 miracle to be beatified, 1 miracle to be canonized. There was a 5-year waiting period after a person's death that he waived for Mother Teresa because he knew her personally. And in turn, after his death, Pope Benedict waived a 5-year waiting period for investigation to see if he could become a saint. And there are actually 2 miracles that can be investigated, or I think are currently being investigated, that can possibly be attributed to John Paul II. One is of a French sister who was suffering from Parkinson's disease, the same disease that claimed the Pope's life. And she prayed the night he died, as well as all the people around her, to God through Pope John Paul II. And the next day, she woke up and was miraculously cured of Parkinson's disease. And the other miracle Father Hansen told me about in my interview, there was a barber that would do the Pope's hair in Italy. This barber was actually a communist, and he had, I believe it was a tumor somewhere in this region. I don't remember exactly what body part it was in, but it was in this area. And later on, when he died, the man's like, I cut this man's hair, and he put pictures of him all over his barbershop. And he went to sleep. The next day he woke up, and his tumor was gone. Did a miracle for a communist. And he was not opposed to talking with communists, other people that you wouldn't typically think the Pope would associate with, such as the premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. He even flew to Cuba to meet with Fidel Castro, where the church had been persecuted a lot. And I actually learned last night, watching a documentary about the Pope, to kind of get my brain in the right frame of mind, that at the Pope's request, Fidel Castro released 300 political prisoners. The Popes went to Cuba and petitioned on their behalf for the 500 political prisoners to be given amnesty, and a month later, Fidel Castro actually granted 300 of them freedom. He was a fearless defender of faith, because it takes someone pretty fearless to yell in Nicaragua against a bunch of protesting military officers, silencio, because he had to talk, and they were yelling, and that wouldn't have worked out. From Dr. Tim Brennan, he said that he carried weight around the world wherever he went, which is very true. Wherever he went, people would listen. People could not ignore him. He was very widely respected on the world stage. He utilized technology, which popes before him were unable to do. Having a pontificate from 1978 until 2005, there were many profound technological changes. He has his own personal laptop computer here that no pope before him would have been able to use because they were not around yet. He met with different Protestant leaders and better relations with the Orthodox churches, which is probably going to be viewed as one of his lasting legacies, because he thought that the division of the church as a whole was fundamentally contradictory to everything Christ said on earth. And he actually returned several icons to the Russian Orthodox Church in particular. And the thing they have in common is they have apostolic succession, which means through the laying of hands, you can trace the ordinations of priests and other clergy all the way back to Jesus and the apostles themselves. And that's something that the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches have, but other branches don't necessarily have. They can trace theirs back to, say, Martin Luther, but then until then, it kind of breaks off there. These two churches and other Orthodox churches, such as the Greeks, can trace theirs all the way back to the beginning of Christianity itself. He also authorized the first universal catechism of the Catholic Church since 1556. That's quite monumental. The first video clip you saw, those two were my first humanity. This is my second humanity, which I will pass out to you. Now, this is an excerpt from an encyclical he wrote, Centesimus Annus, the 100th year. He sent this out to the bishops, and it's relevant to my second subtopic. I have a smaller excerpt here on the slide, but a larger one on the piece of paper that I gave you. He said that it is not wrong to want to live better. What is wrong is a style of life which is directed towards having rather than being, and which wants to have more not in order to be more, but in order to spend life in enjoyment as an end in itself. And this quote kind of ties in my first and second subtopic, because during the latter part of his pontificate, he was more likely to speak out against capitalism than communism, because communism was gone. He didn't really think either economic system was perfect for humanity. He advocated a third way that was in between, not communism, but not really capitalism, more of an enlightened capitalism, because some people argue that capitalism and the focus on profit takes concerns away from the humans and people get exploited in the system. But in communism, people focus more on material objects because they don't have them to begin with. So people are genuinely exploited in communism, and either exploited or at least to a great extent marginalized in full-on capitalism. And it's important that he would say something like this and sent out to the bishops, which would in turn be sent out to the Catholics of the world, and then to the wider world from all the lay people, that him and the Vatican can really relate to people in their everyday life, because a lot of people focus on having things. I mean, I go out and I want to buy stuff to have it, not necessarily to be more because I have it, but it's a cool new thing that I'd like to buy. But this kind of jogs some mental activity as to what exactly the motives are for acquiring things and living in your own life as well as with the people around you. And that concludes my second subtopic. This is now my third subtopic of how does papacy change the influence faith has in public life. And I'm very proud of the way this slide looks. I think it's very nice. He more effectively encouraged the laity than any pope before him. Several of his predecessors have been called prisoners of the Vatican, but obviously he was not, going to over 100 different countries in his, I believe it was 27 years as pope. Very broad diplomatic and ecumenical efforts, talked with more heads of state probably than any predecessor, did more with other religions than any predecessor. His influence over the church and the church's influence over the world as a whole spread, because previously it was all Italians through an Italian lens, and once you got past that small sphere of the world, it wasn't quite as strong when you left it. But the fact that he went and visited Africa and visited the United States and South America and Asia, I think even Australia, he was all over the world. So that he was there would stimulate the Catholics there, and then they would in turn go out and spread the influence of the church to their neighbors. Probably due to the change in rules, but he beatified and canonized more people than any other pope before him. I think the previous record was maybe in the 20s or the teens. I don't recall exactly, but nowhere near 432. Another big consequence of him being so well-traveled was he instituted World Youth Day, which would bring Catholics from all around the world to one location to give them spiritual fire and to make them excited about their faith. He was often in attendance. He would go and meet with them and inspire them to then go out into their lives, into the public square or into their own private lives. And through that, and through young people, he would go and spread the influence as well. He very enhanced the image of the church. He encouraged organizations like Opus Dei and Communion and Liberation, which were organizations for lay people to go out and live their faith in their life. Universal Pastor is one of the titles given to the Pope, and he truly lived that out during his life in spreading this influence in all sorts of corners of the globe, and in turn making the church more enhanced and more influential worldwide. Some of the things as Pope, when he came in, he came after Pope John Paul I, who came after Paul VI, who came after John XXIII, who was really the instigator of Vatican II, and he was in charge of pretty much implementing it because several of his predecessors didn't have very long pontificates, so a lot of it fell on his shoulders, and some people were worried that it wouldn't quite take hold because he was viewed as more conservative. And when he became Pope, he reaffirmed the core teachings of the Catholic Church on issues of life, such as abortion, euthanasia, and other very central teachings of the Church. But as far as the other parts of Vatican II, which he was very much in support of, he kind of oversaw a lot of its implementation. And one of the main things about John Paul II is theology of the body. This is something very well known. When my sister actually went to college, she started hearing about theology of the body. She would always come home on weekends whenever she came back from Truman and talk to my parents about theology of the body and just how profound it was. This was kind of his vision of the human person as a whole, body, mind, spirit, and soul, and kind of how the genders are supposed to interact with each other, who man will be for woman and who woman will be for man. And an article I read recently said it was written by a priest who does a lot with theology of the body, and said that people come to him all the time saying they have marriage problems, and he says, no, you don't have marriage problems, you just don't know how to be a man for her, and you don't know how to be a woman for him. And through his theology of the body, which he would give on Wednesdays, he would have audiences give on Wednesdays, but I think over the course of 5 years, he did teachings, and they were very profound and very widespread, and people still look to them and are very active in using them in relations between men and women. Something also that Father Hansen said to me was, there were testimonies of the Pope traveling around in Italy, and hardened mafia leaders would return to God in his very presence. No telling what they did in their life up until then, but when they saw him and met him, they were overcome, and they would return to God and leave their lives of crime. For the most part, his ecumenical efforts were well received by most. Some people didn't exactly like it, probably because it was different from everything that had been done previously. But on the whole, people liked what he did. He was a very well-loved pope. People not just in the Catholic Church, but on a wider scale, no matter what religion they were, if they were Protestant, if they were Hindu, if they were Muslim, if they were atheistic, you couldn't help but respect this man. And his writings and teachings are so profound that we will be unraveling them for years to come. His leadership of the church made his church stand more credible. He gave them a little more strength. People felt like they could relate to what he had to say, which is felt today a lot more. He made the church more modern, probably because there were a lot more changes in society and technology than any previous pope. Because being pope in 1978 to 2005, very, very profound technological changes. The church was not really thought out of date anymore. Vatican II came around, there were a few popes, and then he came around, and he was there to stay for a long time. So people saw him, like, okay, he's here, he's instituting these, or not instituting them, he's overseeing them. The church is more modernized, but stays very true to its core principles. It made the church stand more desirable by some. He argued that faith can and should influence policy, that separation of church and state is so that the state cannot impose a religion on the people, but lay people need to take their views and take them out into the public square and use their principles to dictate how they act in public life. There were some people who would accuse him of being political. He really did not want priests to be involved in politics. He never held public office, obviously, or other than being a member of the clergy. But some people would accuse him of being political, but his actions were not necessarily political as they were duties of the Pope. I mean, if you call him speaking at the United Nations about the dignity of life political, then yes, he was very political. If you call him issuing encyclicals about different economic philosophies, relating them to how people should live a life of God, then yes, he was very political. But in the traditional sense, he was not political, even though people would probably say that he was. He maintained that true freedom allows for creativity and God's handprint to show through people in what they do in their life. This is my third humanity. This is a cartoon I ran across, and it's kind of a testament to how well loved of a pope he was, saying that St. Peter would in fact be honored to meet him. He has an enduring influence. Cardinal Ratzinger, in this picture, who is now Pope Benedict XVI, was widely viewed as his right-hand man. His papacy is more of a papacy of maintenance. He kind of takes the teachings of John Paul II and keeps them going as kind of a continuation. He's very much a disciple of John Paul II, and you can see a lot of that in what he does now. Something that is kind of carried on is his dialogue with the Anglican Communion. And this is also another visual aid you can pass around of his enduring influence. His name is on that bracelet that I got at the National Catholic Youth Conference back in November. And I think I've worn it probably most every day since then. And through different events in my life, I feel a lot more faithful now. In conclusion, he had a very profound effect on the world as a pope. He preserved and updated the church and its role, and what he started are very much alive today with Pope Benedict XVI. Here's my works cited pages. And return to my central question, what lasting effects did Pope John Paul II have on the role of the Catholic Church on the world stage?